A number of weeks ago, I told you that I absolutely love a specific film. And if you were here, you know that that film was A Few Good Men. Do we have any A Few Good Men fans in the room? All right, a few of you. Excellent. I think it is easily one of the greatest courtroom dramas ever made, okay? Now, in that movie, there are a number of powerful characters. Lieutenant Daniel Kaffee, played by Tom Cruise, Lieutenant Commander Joanne Galloway. We have Captain Jack Ross, and of course, if you're familiar with the film, then you know Colonel Jessup, who is played by the great Jack Nicholson. Now, because I brought it up fairly recently, I've already given a synopsis for the film, so I will not revisit that plot in detail. But I do think that it is helpful to cover and revisit it for one reason. We are about to enter into a scene in the Gospel of Matthew where Jesus is put on trial unfairly. And so returning to this courtroom drama one more time, I think will be helpful. You see, the movie is building and building in what has become a very iconic scene in all of film. And in this scene, Lieutenant Kaffee has Colonel Jessup on the stand, and he's testifying about the events that are in question. I won't spoil it if you haven't seen it. But he's about to take a big risk, Lieutenant Kaffee is. He's about to take a big risk because he needs Colonel Jessup to admit something that will, in his mind, make or break his case. And so as the scene unfolds, Lieutenant Kaffee begins to apply this pressure to Colonel Jessup. And frustration begins to build on the face of the colonel. You can see it visibly on the screen. Isn't he great? He's such a great actor. Kaffee repeatedly questions the colonel's leadership, questions the colonel's character, until the pressure becomes too great. And one of the most iconic lines in all of film was uttered. Lieutenant Kaffee demands the colonel spill the truth, to which the colonel famously exclaims, "You can't handle the truth." Right? Very, very famous line. Well, ironically, it is the exact same sentiment, that very sentiment, that we are going to encounter in our passage today. See, Jesus is on trial because he tells the truth, because he told the truth. And it's actually the truth that's going to lead to Jesus being wrongfully convicted on fabricated charges. So here's the setting for the scene that we have in front of us this week. Jesus has been arrested, he's been betrayed by Judas, and he has been escorted to the home of the high priest, which is where we pick up our story. I'm going to reread verses 57 and 58. It says, "Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled. But Peter followed him at a distance, right up to the courtyard of the high priest. He entered and sat down with the guards to see the outcome. Now the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death." So we have Caiaphas, the high priest, and his role would be a lot like the chief justice of what we would see as like a religious Supreme Court. So Caiaphas is very powerful. And we also have what says the whole Sanhedrin, which is the rest of the leaders of this court. Now, according to the Preaching the Word commentary, this group would have been in total 71 people. So you have 71 officials gathered together at the home of Caiaphas, made up of priests and scribes and elders. And despite what you might assume to be a very religious group based off of those titles, they were actually a lot more like political elites rather than being devout practitioners of their faith. You see, these people, the positions that they have gained, the titles that they have been gained through their wealth, not through their diligence, not through their practice of faith. And so these men, seeing Jesus, are desperate to protect their power. They're desperate to protect it. And we also know that Through various accounts in the Gospel of Matthew, we see that Jesus is a threat to this power, especially in their eyes. So the scene that we have in front of us is set for a very major confrontation between Jesus and the men who see Jesus as a threat to their power. Now, Matthew also mentions Peter in this first part of our section, and he says that Peter is actually following at a distance. Now, we've already talked about the story of Peter, so we won't necessarily go into why that is. If you want to know, you can go back a couple weeks and find that out. But Matthew includes this most likely to show us that Peter is indeed a credible eyewitness to the events that are about to take place. Because otherwise, what we are about to see would be really hard to believe that anyone could justify finding Jesus guilty, other than being guilty of telling the truth. Then in verse 59, the scene begins to unfold, and it says that the Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus. I mean, right there we know that they're not actually going to find anything meaningful, but they're trying to fabricate a type of evidence that they can use, meaning that they would not actually be able to produce anything of substance. And so what they're doing is they're looking around for all of these people, the major crowds that are following this whole scene that's happening, who would bring the false evidence to them so that they could actually march Jesus in front of the Roman authorities, which is what we see happen here in verse 60. It says, "But they did not find any, though many false witnesses came forward. Finally, 2 came forward and declared, 'This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days.' Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, 'Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?' But Jesus remained silent. The high priest said to him, 'I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God.' So after the witnesses come forward, all of them bringing false evidence, none of it withstanding except for when 2 come forward, and they say that Jesus said that he can destroy the temple in 3 days and rebuild it. The thing is this is actually a quote about a prophecy that Jesus gave about his own resurrection. In fact, in John chapter 2, verse 19, we actually see what Jesus is saying, and this is what he says. He says, Jesus answered them, 'Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days.'" And so he did say that. And in this prophecy, Jesus is not actually talking about the physical temple building. Rather, he's referring to his body, which is the presence of God, the temple of the presence of God. And he's telling his disciples that even though his body will be destroyed, meaning he's going to be killed, that 3 days later he will be resurrected. That's what Jesus means by this phrase. And so these 2 witnesses, they twist the words of Jesus, right? They take it out of context, making it seem like he's actually threatening to destroy the temple, which was indeed a punishable offense in this time. So Caiaphas responds. He says, "Are you not going to answer?" Because he's hoping that Jesus will continue to go down this rabbit trail and condemn himself. He says, "Jesus, aren't you going to defend yourself?" But Jesus remains silent. He says nothing. Then the high priest doubles down. He says, "I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." Now, interestingly enough, 2 very ironic things begin to happen in this moment. First, this informal trial that they have Jesus on is breaking just about every rule in the Jewish rule book about trials. Yes, of course they have a rule book, right? It's actually called the Mishnah. And in the Mishnah, the rules for trials are spelled out. And here's a summary of them according to D.S. O'Donnell. It'll be on your screen. All criminal cases must be tried during the daytime and must be completed during the daytime. Criminal cases could not be transacted during the Passover season at all. Only if a verdict was not guilty could a case be finished on the day it was begun. Otherwise, a night must elapse before the pronouncement of the verdict so that feelings of mercy might have time to arise. Further, no decision of the Sanhedrin was valid unless it met in its own meeting place, the hall of hewn stone in the temple precincts. All evidence had to be guaranteed by two witnesses separately examined and having no contact with each other, and false witness was punishable by death. Still further, any trial, the process began by the laying before the court of all the evidence of innocence of the accused before the evidence for his guilt was adduced. So we have this case, this trial, this informal trial that the religious leaders have put Jesus on. And it's happening in the evening when it's not supposed to be happening, during the Passover when it's not supposed to be happening. A guilty verdict is delivered the very same day, not supposed to happen. It wasn't in the proper venue. It's at the home of the high priest, just kind of in his yard. Imagine if that was your trial, just in your backyard. Evidence is being fabricated and no one is being held accountable. And all of these false witnesses go without consequence, and nothing is presented in the form of innocence regarding Jesus. You see, this scene is truly inexcusable. By their very own rules, they are doing this completely wrong. So that's the first irony. Now, the second irony is a little bit more subtle, but it's equally troubling. You see, we know that the high priest demanded an oath from Jesus. He says, by oath, swear that you are the Messiah, the Son of God. Now, what's interesting about that is the fact that oaths are for people who would be either lying or for people who would potentially be liars, and we know that Jesus is neither of those things. And so this pressure that the high priest is trying to put onto Jesus is just simply not going to work. And so the high priest becoming more and more guilty with his own words in condemning Jesus. So he puts this pressure on. He's trying to get Jesus to condemn himself, but instead, Jesus responds with truth, and it wrecks the Sanhedrin. We pick it back up in verse 64. It says, "You have said so," Jesus replied, "but I say to all of you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" "He is worthy of death," they answered. Then they spit on his face and struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, "Prophesy to us, Messiah. Who hit you?" So again, ironically, when the Sanhedrin put Jesus on trial, there is no truth in their process. There's no truth at all. Yet Jesus, when he tells them the truth, this so-called demand for truth, it sends them into this hysterical rage. Jesus tells them, "From now on, you will see me at the right hand of my Father." Which is a warning to the Sanhedrin, telling them that even though you might sit in judgment over me in this moment, eventually I will sit in the judgment seat, the final judgment seat over them and over everyone when the time comes. Now, of course, this further enrages the group because their power is being threatened even more. And now they begin to physically abuse and mock Jesus. You see, with one truthful proclamation, Jesus advances his trial, doesn't defend himself, but instead knows what's about to happen needs to happen. And so he tells the truth, which sends the Sanhedrin to now bring Jesus to stand before the Roman official named Pilate. So we're going to jump into Matthew 27. We're going to pick it up in verse 11. This is what it says. "Meanwhile, while Jesus stood before the governor," so now he's officially in front of the Roman authorities, "and the governor asked him, 'Are you the king of the Jews?' Again, Jesus says, 'You have said so,' Jesus replied. When he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate asked him, 'Don't you hear the testimony that they are bringing against you?' But Jesus made no reply, not even a single charge to the great amazement of the governor. You see, Jesus is standing trial. He stood trial before the religious leaders who eventually produced what they needed to bring Jesus to the Roman authority. And this is a critical step because Rome is indeed the governing authority over this region. And so they actually had to sign off on all legal matters. Even though the Sanhedrin were to find him guilty, it didn't really matter unless Rome said, yes, this man is guilty. Which means that Jesus is now on trial for a second time in the matter of hours. But the Sanhedrin knows something. They know that Rome does not care about Jesus' spiritual claims. They're like, if this guy wants to claim to be God, we don't care. We have thousands of gods. Let him be a god, whatever, right? That's their mindset. And so the Sanhedrin knows, like, we have to get him to say something that's going to condemn him in a legal Roman mind. So they skew the truth. And they tell Pilate, Jesus is claiming to be the king of the Jews. Now, why this matters is because Jesus now becomes a political threat to Rome, which forces Pilate to hear the case. But when Pilate asks Jesus about these charges, Jesus still does not argue the false charges. He simply says, you have said it so. And so Pilate, feeling stuck, feeling like I just have to imagine Pilate's mind, like, I know better. This guy is causing no trouble for me. They're super angry about this. They haven't even followed their own rules about all of this. So he says, I think I have a plan. I think he has his own wisdom that's presenting this idea where he might be able to present the crowd with a choice that they would certainly choose what he believes to be right. And that's what we see in verses 15 through 18. It says, now it was the governor's custom at the festival to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. At that time, they had a well-known prisoner whose name was Jesus Barabbas. So when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, which one do you want me to release to you? Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who was called the Messiah? For he knew it was out of self-interest that they had handed Jesus over to him. See, Pilate knows that he has this man, Jesus Barabbas, in custody who is guilty of actual crimes, insurrection, and murder. This guy actually did some bad stuff. And so, as is custom during the Passover, the governor would actually each year release one prisoner of the crowd's choosing just to set them free, signaling the Passover. So Pilate offers the two people to the crowd, Jesus and Barabbas, because Pilate believed certainly once they see who Jesus is being compared to, this man who's guilty of murder and insurrection, they're going to choose to let Jesus go. This will all be over with. And in the midst of all of this, Matthew actually gives us a very small but important detail from the scene. It's in verse 19. So all of this is going on. It says, while Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent to him this message, don't have anything to do with this innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him. So you have this chaotic scene, this false trial, where Jesus is being accused wrongly in every single way. And Pilate's wife actually sends him this message. This message says, this man is innocent. This man is innocent. And she knows it to be true because it was a prophetic dream that she had been given. Now, it would be easy if you're reading this whole section because there's so many egregious things happening in this passage to just kind of gloss over this one specific line. In fact, Pilate himself actually glosses over it. He seems to brush his wife off. But I don't want us to miss this moment because it's very important. First, it says, while Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, which is Matthew's way of showing us that Pilate is indeed the single legal authority in this matter. Ultimately, it does not matter what the Sanhedrin wants. If they're going to do what they're going to do, they're going to do what they're going to do. But but Pilate has the authority in the matter. And he knew, it said that he knew that they had brought him against their own self-interest. He knew that Jesus was innocent. So he should have released Jesus. He should have set him free, regardless of what the crowds were demanding. Then Pilate's wife sends him a note about Jesus' innocence. Now it's mounting. Not only does he feel it, but he has his wife send him a note saying, this man is innocent, and I have suffered a great deal in a dream because I know that he's innocent. Do not do this. Now we don't know what she saw in her dream, but we know it caused her to suffer a great deal and to seek out her husband and to find him in the middle of this chaotic mess and implore him, don't have anything to do with this moment. Do not do what you are about to do. Which brings out another irony to the surface. Other than Jesus, in this moment, Pilate's wife is the only other person interested in the truth. In this moment, other than Jesus, who is speaking the truth, is on trial for speaking the truth, one person is also interested in the truth, and it's Pilate's wife. You see, the religious leaders want Jesus' life gone. They want him dead. And Pilate, he just wants there to be social order. He wants this to go away without escalating. Everyone with the power to do the right thing lacked the courage to do it. But Pilate's wife was not afraid. She is the brave one in this moment. Still, Pilate ignores her plea, and he eventually caves under the pressure. In verse 20, we see it escalating. It says, but the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed. Which of the two do you want me to release to you? Asked the governor. Barabbas, they answered. What shall I do then with Jesus, who is called the Messiah? Pilate asked. They all answered, crucify him. Why? What crime has he committed? Asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, crucify him. When Pilate saw that this was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. I am innocent of this man's blood, he said. It is your responsibility. All the people answered, his blood is on us and on our children. Then he released Barabbas to them, but had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. So we see the crowds are relentless. Despite the truth and despite Jesus' innocence, the crowds are relentless. And the second trial reveals an even greater level of contempt that the religious leaders have for Jesus, which reveals yet another irony. Because the same people who were worshiping Jesus just a week prior, as he entered on Palm Sunday, worshiping, claiming he's the Messiah, are now the people who are screaming, kill him. Pilate realizes that he is going to have to make a decision, and instead of standing up for justice, which is his official responsibility for this moment, instead of doing that, he says, I am innocent of this man's blood. It is your responsibility. But despite his attempts to rid himself of the responsibility, Pilate is now and forever a culprit in the murder of the innocent Messiah, Jesus. Charles Spurgeon says it like this. He says, oh, the daring of Pilate, thus in the sight of God to commit murder and disclaim it. There is a strange mingling of cowardliness and courage about many men. They are afraid of a man, but not afraid of the eternal God, who can destroy both body and soul in hell. You see, woven throughout this intensely sad account of Jesus' two trials, the one where he stands before the Sanhedrin and the religious leaders, and the other one where he stands before Pilate, the Roman governor of this region, we have a story before us that is truly full of irony. People who proclaimed Jesus, who want to seek the truth according to their words. They did absolutely everything to hide the actual truth because they wanted an innocent man dead. People who were responsible for upholding God's law broke almost every rule regarding legal proceedings so that they could convict the very God that they were claiming to protect. People who had the power to protect Jesus ended up being the very people who sealed his death. And the one brave person, second only to Jesus in this account, was an unnamed woman who declared Jesus' innocence and begged for his release. There is no question in my mind that this account of Jesus' trial is tragic in many ways. But we also know that this is how it had to go, according to Scripture. So now we turn our hearts and minds from the details of this story to some personal reflection. We are in the middle of this season called Lent, which is a season in the church calendar where that has been designed for Christians to prepare their hearts and their minds for the upcoming celebration we call Easter. And for those of us who know the whole story, the whole Easter story, which concludes with this triumphant resurrection, Jesus defeating death on our behalf, it's all beautiful because we know, but Lent serves as an opportunity to reflect on scenes like this one and incorporate that into our own story so that it may soften our heart to the reality of what Jesus endured, so that it can soften our heart to the reality of what the disciples experienced in these really tragic moments. So I want to give you a question for your consideration. How might God be using this part of Jesus' heroic story to turn your heart and your mind towards him? How might God be using this part of Jesus' heroic story to turn our hearts and our minds towards him? See, I think this last irony will help us understand the significance of what Jesus did for us. Jesus, the Messiah, took on everything he didn't deserve, right? The guilt, the abuse, the mockery, and eventually a brutal death. He took on all of that. He didn't deserve it in order to give us everything we don't deserve. Forgiveness, mercy, grace, and eternal life. And as a result of this profound act of love, I think it is appropriate that we respond to Jesus in two specific ways. First and foremost, we turn our attention to Jesus. What does that mean? Why our attention? Today, we know that one of the most valuable commodities in all of the world is our attention, right? The attention economy has become one of the most competitive economies in the world because what consumes our attention ultimately gets the rest of us, doesn't it? Therefore, attention is another word for worship. Right? That's what worship is. It's turning your attention towards something. And so we all worship something, but do we give our attention to Jesus? So it becomes incredibly important that we turn our attention to Jesus in this season as we reflect. And the second response that I believe is appropriate is that we follow the way of Jesus. You see, as our lives become increasingly fragmented with the entire world at our fingertips in the matter of small computers like this one, right? Jesus is actually inviting us into a way of life that is designed for our flourishing. I say this all the time when people ask me about Jesus' teachings and why he demands certain things and rebukes other things. And the reality of it is that everything Jesus commands of us is designed to bring us into greater flourishing. And everything that Jesus rebukes or wants us to move away from is so that we don't move into a situation or a pattern of living that will ultimately take us out of flourishing. You see, this is not a despotic God who wants us to just be obedient to be obedient. Obedience to the way of Jesus is actually how we flourish here on earth. It's actually how we move into the best version of our life to avoid the pitfalls and troubles that the enemy has laid before us. So we move into the way of Jesus. And it doesn't happen by accident. In fact, as we've observed over the past 2 months, we eventually will have to decide, much like the disciples did, to follow him. And at Foundation Church, we say this: we exist to help people follow Jesus. And our approach is stated like this: we are leading people to be with Jesus. We are teaching people to become like Jesus, and we are equipping people to do what Jesus did. You see, in this season, as we prepare our hearts for Easter, and more specifically, Jesus' death and eventual resurrection, these events are not easy to hear. We've been on this Matthew journey for over 20 months, and we've taken a slow and deliberate approach, which means the events of the last 48 hours of Jesus' life are broken up over 6 weeks, and they are heavy. You feel it. I see it in your faces. Right? I'm preaching this to you, and you're like getting increasingly like lower into your seats. And everything, I'm an optimist, so everything within me is like, I wish I could just get past this, but that's not the point. The point is to prepare our hearts for the eventual celebration. Jesus defeated death on our behalf. He gave us everything we didn't deserve and everything that we need to have eternal life because he loved us, not because we deserve it. And so a few weeks of sinking into our chairs, of feeling the weight of what the disciples felt, of feeling the weight of what Jesus felt, I'm just going to say it's worth it. It's worth it. And so as we enter into the way of Jesus, as we do what Jesus did and learn to be with Jesus and learn to become like Jesus, we take moments like this and see that Jesus told the truth. Jesus told the truth. And as a result of the gift that was given to us because he told the truth, we are being invited into this way of Jesus. So I'm going to have the band come back up, but for just a moment, we're going to have a time of quiet reflection. And I'd like for us to consider this question: how is God inviting you into the way of Jesus? I'll put it on the screen. I'll say it again. How is God inviting you into the way of Jesus? We're just going to take 60 seconds. We're going to close our eyes and quietly reflect.